Good evening, everyone. My name is Nick Wilson, and I'm the Senior Director of Gun Violence Prevention here at the Center for American Progress. I am just so touched that so many of you chose to spend your evening with us today to the East Coast premiere of a wonderful documentary that I'm so excited for all of you to watch. Before we get started, most of you grabbed your pizza. Remember, feel free to grab more. And if you need to use the restroom, just take a left and you'll see signs, and it's kind of right behind us over there. So feel free to excuse yourself at any time. As you all know, this is the 25th, it's been 25 years since the horrific tragedy in Columbine. And I want to first of all thank Brady United for partnering with us to bring this film screening here today. It's been really wonderful to have such a great partner, really trying to center the voices of survivors as we continue this fight every day to end gun violence in the country. So we're going to have a 36-minute documentary followed by a Q&A with the two subjects of the panel, Kiki and Kallie, as well as Tom Mauser, whose son Daniel was killed in the tragic shooting. And then we're going to have Stefan from Team Enough to kind of close it up and bring us back kind of to the present and how much has changed and how much has stayed the same in the past 25 years in the fight against gun violence. When I was thinking about how to open this, there were so many different things I could have talked about. As a policy person, I wanted to talk about just how many failures that kind of led to Columbine and how the media coverage made us learn all the wrong lessons. I want to talk about how, as someone who was in middle school, this was really impactful on me. But this isn't about me. This is about the survivors, which is why I love this film. But to put in perspective how consequential Columbine is and how much it still is so present in our thinking about gun violence, a recent survey of 10,000 Americans, they just asked a simple question. Name the first school shooting that comes to mind that happened in your lifetime. And I was actually surprised to hear that 35% of respondents said Columbine. That's more than Sandy Hook, Parkland, Uvalde, and even Las Vegas, the most deadly shooting in American history combined. And this wasn't just Gen Xers or elder millennials like myself, but it was even Gen Z. It was across all demographics. And there's a couple of reasons why it looms so large. First of all, it might not have been the first school shooting, but the scale and the innocence of the children really made a difference. But it was also the media coverage. It was the first school shooting in this digital age. We didn't quite have social media, but we had this unprecedented wall-to-wall coverage. Of course, much of what the media said was wrong. Many of us, when we think of Columbine, we think of the shooters and how much we saw their faces and trench coat mafia, and was it music videos or was it video games? But really the truth was the media coverage inspired a lot of deadly copycats. And I'm excited today that we're not going to focus on what went wrong or the shooters, but really the impact that this deadly violence had on individuals, on families, and on the Columbine community, and how that still resonates today. And 25 years later, Columbine and the families still aren't the same. And so I'm so glad that Brady helped us bring in some wonderful panelists to hear from today. Jeff and Kiki, both when I was talking to them earlier, they're saying part of what motivated them to do this was the story hasn't been told, and when they've been asked, when the media came in, descended on the Columbine, as we've seen in so many shootings since, they didn't treat the survivors with respect, they didn't tell the story, they twisted it to their own narrative. So today you're not going to hear a lot about the usual B-roll you see of these incidents. It's going to be focusing on what really matters, and that's the individuals. I am thinking about, if this happened a year ago, I would talk about how not much has changed since Columbine. How, 1993, we had universal background checks. Right after Columbine, Tom and many of his people in Columbine, they went to the NRA, they went to Congress, they went to the White House, and they demanded changes, and we didn't get that until recently. Many of people, I see some great advocates from Brady and Giffords in every town, and a lot of friends in the room. And thanks to the hard work of so many countless advocates over the past 25 years, we finally have made real progress. And we passed the Bipartisan Safer Community Act 2 years ago. And just last week, the White House announced that we are closer than ever to universal background checks, and 20,000 additional people that are selling and profiting off of guns without background checks, no questions asked, they're going to be held accountable and they're going to be regulated. So I want to thank all the advocates in the room. I see My friend Rob, yeah. I see my friend Rob Wilcox in the back. For a very long time at Everytown, he was working so hard to make sure universal background checks became a thing. He was working day in, day out to make sure it was included in the Bipartisan Safer Community Act. And now that he's the Deputy Director of the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, he was able to help with the administration to make this a reality. So it's easy to feel hopeless sometimes and to read the newspaper and see that the mass shootings are still on the rise. But we're making real progress thanks to people like you that care, that are showing up, engaging in these conversations, and I hope this inspires you to continue to advocate like the subjects of the film. So with that, I'm going to be quiet and let you enjoy this wonderful presentation, and then we're excited for some Q&A and panels afterwards. Thank you all so much for being here.
After that, it's important for us in this moment to just take one collective deep breath. Okay, one more. Breathe in and exhale. You're laughing, Jeff.
Because it's a hard movie. That's why I'm like, you gotta laugh sometime.
Yeah.
We've seen it many times now, so there are a couple lighter moments that kind of let you breathe, but it's kind of a lot of tension. There's a lot of tension in the film. So.
Yeah, and I'd like for you, so I'm Arnita Holloman, I'm Director of Gun Violence Prevention here on the GVP team at CAP. So honored to be here with you all. I'd like for you to, I know at least two people on the stage, it's pretty obvious who they are. However, I'd like for you to each introduce yourselves or say who you are and why it was important or why it's important for this film to be shown and films like this, why they're important.
Well, I'm Jeff Vespa. I directed the film, and I started doing this during Parkland. I went to Parkland 10 days after the shooting, and I was there for 3 months and did a movie about Parkland, fairly similar to this, but that movie is very raw because people had just experienced it, and this is much more about long-term trauma because it's, over 25 years. So I felt like this is a part of the story that hasn't been told. So I thought it was, especially around the 25th anniversary, I thought it was a very important thing to revisit it. So.
My name's Kiki Leyba, and still teaching at Columbine. And I thought this was a unique opportunity. I was very unsure when first got a call from Jeff, and just, I wondered how could this be different than anything else that's ever been written about us or said about us. And, I think we often felt, we didn't trust the media and that sort of thing. And so I did see Jeff's Parkland film and thought it was amazing and powerful. And thought that, maybe this was it. Maybe this was the right time and the right person to work with. And it was an opportunity to, I wanted to be real. I wanted to be sincere and take some risks and say some things that I'd never spoken before. And because I think it's important for people to hear those things. And for me, a big thing is I just never want people to make the mistakes that I made or that I witnessed some of my peers making as we were, trying to come back from this horrific event and dealing with all of the trauma. So that was, for me, that was the reason to get involved and and why to do it. And also, I think Jeff would tell you, I also thought it was really important for people to hear the perspective of Kallie, because I just think that's a voice that you don't get to hear from very often, and it really gives you some context. So.
Hi, Kallie Leyba, as you know. I think this film is important because we know that it's inevitable that other people are going to experience trauma. And of course, we hope that we can stop the gun violence trauma, but we can't stop all trauma, even if even if we could. And so understanding the perspective, but also so that when we're talking about gun violence prevention, we frame the conversation around the impact on the community, that this isn't just the lives that are lost, just the families who lost children, lost family members, but the impacts are vast and they last for a very long time. When Jeff interviewed us, honestly, I just thought, oh, I'm going to be 90 seconds in a movie. Like if you've ever done, a TV interview, they cut like 15 seconds, whatever. They'll pick the best 15 seconds. I'll be fine. So I just left it all on the field, never realizing that this was going to become a movie about Kiki and I, and that I was going to tell the world that for 5 to 7 years, I didn't think we should have been married. So
That was news to our youngest son.
But it was easy for me to talk to Jeff because honestly, no one had ever asked my perspective. So I was, as Jeff says, it was like he pulled a cork out and I just let it all out.
And I'm Tom Mauser. I'm the father of Daniel Mauser, one of the students killed at Columbine. And where this was important for me, a couple of perspectives. One is, it's just simply the fact that I haven't faced this. I frankly didn't know much about what Kiki went through. I was in my own field of trauma, and it was a very different kind. I saw, my experience of it was from the outside of, where's my son and did he survive? Not being at the school and having lived through that particular trauma. And it's also important to me because in the past few years, I have been talking more about trauma and going beyond just those who lost lives. Why? Because I saw my son's friends. I have seen some of my son's friends who, I've seen alcoholism, I've seen a kid who's, I think is just lost. And I've seen kind of firsthand just how difficult it can be for people. And it just really bothers me that it seems society doesn't want to really talk about that. It doesn't want to deal with this reality of what trauma is all about. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation so that people can understand what happens to people.
Tom, you just touched on something that also Kiki and Kallie, you talked about in the film around, in grief work, we understand ambiguous loss. So this is the loss of the things you cannot see or other people don't see or don't acknowledge. So that may be the loss of, not seeing Daniel get married one day, or the loss of, you talked about Kallie, with Kiki, him not being the man that you remembered him to be, and having to, grieve and build this new understanding of who he is. Can you talk more about what that felt like to come to the realization that you were experiencing losses that were not being acknowledged, not being seen, but then on the other side, what you're feeling now after you've had time to tell your stories and to share your own experiences?
So I read Joan Didion's book, The Year of Magical Thinking. I highly recommend it. Her husband dies, and she magically for a year thinks that he'll come back. And that was the moment when I was sobbing on the bed and called Kiki up, and I realized that that's exactly what was happening. And I was holding like the version of Kiki that I remembered, which was definitely with rose-colored glasses, right? We remember people back. And so I had this man on a pedestal, and I kept expecting him to become that man again. And so reading this book by Didion was just a life-changing moment for me. And so I did. I grieved. I said, now I have to grieve. So, just give me some space, give me some time. and then came to love him. And we watched this movie with some friends at our house who, there was a shooting in Colorado at STEM school 5 years ago, and they both had kids who attend that school. And my friend Nora, after the movie, just held me and sobbed and said words that I didn't understand because she was crying so hard. And the next day she texted me a message that she realized that her daughter died that day, and that I was giving her permission to grieve the girl she lost and then really come to admire and love the girl that she's become. So I think this is probably a fairly common phenomenon. And the fact that trauma therapists they were doing the best they could, but you're fine. Everything's fine. You'll be fine. Just grieve for a couple months and life goes on, and it doesn't. You're irrevocably changed. Kiki was, but I was too.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, because in grief work, we understand that everything changes forever, right? And so it's not just a couple of months. Tom, please talk more about Daniel. Tell us about Daniel and how you came to become a gun violence prevention advocate.
Sure. Daniel was 15 when he died at Columbine. He was a straight A student. He was a Boy Scout, played piano. What I most admired about him was the fact that he took on his weaknesses. He was not at all athletic, and yet he, on his own, chose to go out for the cross-country squad. He was extremely shy, and yet he chose on his own to join the debate team at Columbine, where he had to get up in front of other people. And that really was a great inspiration for me. And the direct thing for me was the fact that 2 weeks before the tragedy at Columbine, Daniel asked me a question based on conversation he heard with some other debate members. Dad, did you know there were loopholes in the Brady Bill? The law that required background checks. And I just kind of blew it off. No, I didn't know about that, Daniel. And then he was killed with a gun that was purchased through one of those loopholes in the Brady Bill. So how could I not act on that? And that's what really turned me into an activist. And it was really his, that was inspired me, because I'm also an introvert. So it took something to put myself up there at the protest of the NRA convention in 10 days after Columbine to speak. But I felt, I knew Daniel's words, and I felt I had to act on them.
Thank you. So you talked about some of the mental health, like the impact on, your mental health after something like this. But what's not often talked about is the connection between your mental health and your physical health and what's happening in your body. Kiki, can you talk a little bit about the physical impact? And then Jeff, if you could follow up with why it'd be important to include these parts in future films.
Gosh, my physical health was terrible. I took 3 ambulance rides in a span of a year. And I don't know if you're familiar with comedian Brian Regan, but he does a piece about having to call an ambulance for himself. And I had that experience. I had to call an ambulance for myself. My body was screaming at me. I think the trauma, the PTSD that I was experiencing was beginning to manifest itself in physical ways. I've had asthma since I was a kid, but never really an issue. Never had, been hospitalized for it or anything. And all of a sudden, I was having these respiratory illnesses. I had horrific shoulder pain. I couldn't raise my right arm. There was just all kinds of symptoms that felt like my body was just screaming at me. And of course, I was in a fog as it was, and I wasn't making that connection to PTSD and the trauma that I was experiencing, although I had, been dealing with that as far as with my mental health, but my physical health, I just hadn't made that connection yet. I don't know if you want to.
Well, I mean, then, well, you said that the shoulder pain, they called it your phantom bullet wound. The idea that, like, you know, this pain was manifesting as like this phantom bullet wound. But, you know, the crazy thing about all this is, you know, he says in the movie, I could die. I mean, he says it out. It's not like, it's like we talked about it, but I never once thought, oh, maybe I should ask about his physical health during this time. And he didn't either. I mean, it's like he didn't bring it up. And we screened the movie last week in LA, and after the premiere, we went out to dinner and we were talking about that moment. And they were like, yeah, I went in an ambulance 3 times and I had this phantom bullet wound. And I was like, wait a minute, what? Like, you know, I was like, hold on, like, I'm gonna have to ask that question from now on every movie that I, you know, talk to people about this, because not only, I mean, I think this movie captures it. Not only do we never hear stories from other people that aren't victims, we definitely never hear about physical health. Like, we hear about the mental health, but we certainly don't hear about the physical. So what I like about this movie right now is that it really is uncovering things that you just never hear, and I think that's really important. I believe this movie can be used as a teaching tool. I think it can be helpful for so many people. People that are experiencing trauma, people that need to understand other people that are experiencing trauma. But that little piece, even now, like we are even learning ourselves. Even the people that experienced it are learning these things that we just didn't even connect. So I think that was such a crazy piece, and that's why we actually, from now on, when we do these screenings, we want to bring that up, because it's such another important, you know, thing that we just don't talk about. So.
I would just add the phantom gunshot wound. When we realized how he ran, if he had been shot, that's probably where he'd been shot. And so he really did have this shoulder injury with no explanation whatsoever. So, and then all the medical professionals that we saw, no one ever, you know, put that together either. So I'm sure, again, this was a long time ago and we know better now.
Well, I mean, but I don't even think we do know better now. That's what I'm saying. Like, I mean, to me, you know, I interviewed Kiki for 3 days, and he kept saying to me, like, well, he didn't keep saying to me. He said it once. He's like, you really should talk to Kallie. And when he said that, I was like, wait a minute, that's an amazing idea. Like, I've never talked to someone that's not a victim, you know? And he had kind of told me a little bit about the story, about the intervention and stuff. And so I was like, okay, this is really important. I got to do this. And I just think, again, this story is like a first. Like, it's a first, you know, somebody telling this kind of like the person next to the person's story. But I think the health thing is important too. And I just think that this is the problem actually with this kind of topic. We don't know any of this stuff. You've never seen it represented in a movie or a TV show, this thing, you know, you just don't see it. And I just think it's so important. I think, you know, again, when we had these screenings in LA, the conversations was what was so powerful, that we were like, we now discovered what this movie really is, and that, you know, what we have is something that really can help people.
So often after a mass shooting like Columbine and Parkland and others, there's a lot of media coverage, right? And so the shooters talked about, the victims are talked about, less often those of you that are on the stage. But can you talk a little bit about what happens after all of that goes away?
I'm going to talk about another little aspect of that immediately afterwards, and something that I've been really bothered with, and that is this tendency, more than a tendency in America, to come out with these phrases like Uvalde strong, Nashville strong. At one level, I understand the community wants to heal and wants people to, you know, come together. But there's another part of it that bothers me, that I think that part of it is a little bit like the policeman that's, you know, there at the crime scene saying, move along, nothing to be seen here, move along. I think there's an aspect of that, and it's about trauma. And it's about, oh, it's this embarrassment on the community. It's a terrible thing that happened. Oh, we're strong, we can get through this. But I think in a way that it kind of suppresses action on the part of the community to help people who've been traumatized. And we can't have that. We've already seen that happen for years in this country, especially when it comes to veterans. Think back to World War II. They had a word for it. I can't recall what it is. Maybe somebody remembers. It's the soldiers who were taken off the field because they...
Shell-shocked. Shell-shocked?
Shell shock. There was another one too, but especially shell shock. And then as the years went on, all of a sudden, I don't know how much it was in Vietnam, but especially with the Iraq War, all of a sudden it started getting a bit more recognized. And it has to be recognized and dealt with because we're losing so many veterans to suicide. So many of them. And it's usually with a gun. And we can't possibly let them deny them a gun. They were a veteran, you know. What do you mean they can't have a gun?
Yeah, we had a veteran that came to the screening in LA, and he said he felt very aligned with, you know, what Kiki went through and stuff. So I completely agree.
Did anyone else want to add to that?
I agree with Tom completely that the communities and maybe the nation, there is this urgency that we get to a place of healing, and it was just a few weeks after the tragedy that we experienced that one of our local newspapers, when we had print newspapers, their headline they ran was "Let the Healing Begin," as if they were in charge of it, as if they could make a proclamation that now was the time, and you know we're all going to lead the charge with this, you know, black and white paper headline. And I think it really is a broken idea to think that there's going to be this sort of rush to healing or some sort of a closure that exists because we have ribbons and we have balloons and we have a 5K on the anniversary, and you know we do these, you know, our strong T-shirts, and meanwhile there's all of this brokenness that exists that is not being addressed and not being talked about. And yeah, I think we do want, you know, we wanted to feel normal again, but clearly it's a process. You know, it's a process, and it takes, I don't know, I think it takes a group of people. And just think for a moment, if you're familiar with PTSD at all, I think about the year when we went back, that following year, we had, I think there was like 1,600 people with PTSD, varying degrees of PTSD in one place. I don't know if it was better that we were together or if they should have just split us up so, you know, we couldn't even see each other. But when I hear about these, you know, mass shootings, no matter where it is, I think about that there's all these people that are highly impacted, and how are they being cared for? How are they being treated? How are we even considering that as part of the, you know, the gun violence epidemic? And I also think about, you know, we had each other to you know, I think kind of walk through it. And I talk about when those freshmen leave, how I thought, man, it was just going to be this adults, and we were going to look so broken compared to everybody else. It was going to be so obvious how screwed up we were, because before we could kind of blend in with all the other, you know, screwed up kids, right? I think about the shooting in Vegas and those people who travel from all over the country, and they have this horrific event, and then they all leave and they return to their spouses or partners. They go back home, but they're all alone. They don't have a community of survivors or any sort of support. There's no resiliency center set up in their neighborhood. They're trying to walk through that all on their own. And that, to me, that is just horrific.
Yeah, and it's still 25 years. I mean, the thing that I think also is important about the film, what it kind of should get people to understand is it never goes away. It's 25 years later. You're still dealing with it to this day. When I've interviewed the other people in Columbine, everybody cried. It was 25 years later. Everybody cried. So it's still, I mean, to you, it happened yesterday. It's not, didn't happen 25 years ago. Like it, and I think people don't, that's the other thing, that there is no such thing as getting over it. That doesn't happen, period. Like,
You are so right, and I don't know why I thought I should sit in that chair without a tissue handy. Like,
we take bets
thinking.
on how
I
quickly
know.
how many
made it
minutes it takes for her to
10
cry.
minutes. I made it 10 minutes today, so it's better than some, worse than others. But, you know, when we did have Jefferson Center for Mental Health set up and Kiki could go for health, I don't think I could have. I don't think I was eligible, but it didn't even occur to me to ask. But by the time he was very, very sick, that was gone. They actually called me and said, the money's gone. You have to go through your insurance for mental health care. And everybody knows what that looks like for 2 teachers with 3 kids. And then I said, well, what about workers' comp? And well, the workers' comp claim had expired because that's only open for a year. And I, wanted to scream at the top of my lungs. It's called post-traumatic stress disorder. So the injury didn't actually happen on April 20th. The injury happened post, but that argument, of course, got me nowhere with that bureaucracy. So, I mean, my other just practical advice for anybody who goes through anything is just keep your claim open forever. Just go every 364 days. For treatment. And that's why I roll my eyes in the movie when I say PTSD. I see that, like, it's because I'm still so bitter about that, because this had a huge financial impact on us as well.
Yeah, you all made some really great points. And the truth is that we never get to that place of healing if we aren't honest about where we are, how we are. And so not to suck it up and be strong, right? But also what we need, right? And what that process looks like. And so I just appreciate you all being willing to share your experience with us tonight. I know we have to move on to audience questions, but I'll ask one last question of you all as they prepare to get mics ready for the audience. What advice would you give to this room full of, which I'm sure, advocates and policymakers and concerned folks who are, really trying to move the needle forward in gun violence prevention and support for survivors? What bit of, advice would you give them?
I would say, take care of yourself. When Kallie did that intervention on me, I was 5 years out. And I think that's another reason I feel it's so important to do work with other survivors and victims, because I don't want them to make that mistake. That didn't have to happen. One of my peers, she started going to counseling like just days afterwards, and I know Kallie did it as well. I thought I was in a good place. I had been in therapy before. I thought I was strong. I thought I could do it. I poured myself into the kids. I know it's easy to pour yourself into the work, but we all know the oxygen mask, that we have to take care of ourselves if we're going to be good to anybody. And I know that for me, whenever I work with survivors, and I love that opportunity, I want to be in a good place. And the last thing I'd ever want to do is go, like when I got to meet with the Sandy Hook staff, the last thing I want to do is to sit in front of those people who've been through this horrific event, and then I just come undone because I haven't done the work. And I've seen that happen, and I just think that I don't know. We've got to make ourselves important as we continue to do the work. We have to be appropriately selfish and do that self-care, and because we're in it for the long haul.
Of course, yes, he's right. And also, I'm a union leader. I'm an executive director for AFT in Colorado. And so it's just in my personality to be an activist. And for me, that's the place of empowerment for me. If I am not actively doing something, I feel helpless. And when I am doing something, that's how I regain control and power. So yes, we must take care of ourselves, but I think we just have to keep fighting the good fight and celebrating the wins, even if they're not that big. You know, we talk a lot about gun legislation in Colorado that can seem like it's just baby steps, but it's huge. It's, you know, it is baby steps, but babies walk and then babies run, and that's huge. So we need to celebrate the wins and then just keep working together as a community.
I guess some of my advice would be, one, if you are in a position of grief, you know, do not feel afraid or reluctant to get counseling. You know, we went for counseling soon after Columbine. My wife was more of I'll read. She likes to read, so she wanted to read the book. But no, we needed to go to talk to somebody who can hear the two of us and see where there may be conflict. And indeed, there was conflict. There was a lot of conflict. Our grief counseling really turned into marriage counseling because my wife was a very, very, very private person, did not want to deal with any of what I was dealing with, and I all of a sudden, despite being an introvert, I became an activist. So there was a lot of conflict there. We had to talk through a lot of that. Also, I guess another thing I would say, if you're encountering somebody who's been through trauma, don't let yourself make too many assumptions about where they're at, because people can be in so many different places or show one particular behavior or tendency, and maybe that's not really what it is. So, for example, you know, it's common for a number of people, especially people in the media, to say, so this activism of yours, you do all this gun control work, that must really make you feel satisfied and helps you deal with your grief. No, not really. I mean, I do it for my son, but I can't really say I like doing it. I do it because I felt I had an ability to do it. I can't explain how I overcame that grief and that being introverted to do what I do. I can't explain it other than I do it through the strength of my son. That's why I wear his shoes. I feel the shoes give me power. These are the shoes he was wearing that day at Columbine. So I take inspiration from that, but I also hate it. I think I was telling you, when I'm down at the state capitol, I hate it. I actually hate it. I like testifying. I like taking on the issue, but frankly, it takes me back to those early days, especially the early years after Columbine, being down there where we faced so much resistance from the Republicans and got nothing done. I hated being down there. The hate mail that I've gotten over the years from pro-gun people, I don't like that. I don't really particularly like doing the public speaking that much. So does it bring me a lot of healing? Maybe, but I do it for a different reason. So, and likewise, if somebody is having trouble speaking about their trauma, don't pass judgment on them. That's where they're at. Maybe they'll be in a different place at a different time, but if that's where they're at, oh gee, you know, we see that your wife doesn't speak. Maybe she'd feel better if she spoke out more. Who in the hell are you to say that? You know, she's where she is at, and you don't live her life. So let people be where they're at, and maybe they can get some help. They can get into a different place. But don't think that you can push them there. That's, I guess, what I would say.
Well, for me, I mean, this is what I do, is try to give people a voice and tell their stories. So to me, it's trying to capture people's stories. So I think that's the one thing that we have that's far outstrips any movement, is once you tell these stories and you tell them in this way where there's no politics, you don't tell people what to do, you don't talk about guns. It's really hard to be against somebody when they tell you what this has done to them. So,
Thank you. So we have time for maybe one or two questions, and they will bring the mics to you. So we've got two here.
You can say your name and affiliation, please. Hi, my name is Rose O'Brien. I have a question related to community events. You mentioned how often after shootings there's the tendency to have like a Boston Strong or Uvalde Strong type of events and force this healing. I'm curious, in your experience going around the country, what are some events or experiences that you thought brought the community together and gave them the opportunity to heal in a healthy way?
Well, it took us quite a while to figure that out. We never held classes again on April 20th after the tragedy because we received so many threats and all kinds of stuff. And so it was never going to make sense to have classes, right? Even years later. So now we have we call it it's Day of Service. Our entire school community has a community service day on April 20th. We started doing this in 2017. And it's been a huge success. This Saturday, we'll have several thousand students and staff all over in the community doing whatever service projects they choose. And we now have people doing it in dozens of states across the country, and we have a couple of countries in Europe and one in Africa, and we even have Antarctica involved. So it's been a really cool thing to see that it changed that day. For me, it has absolutely changed that day. I love that idea, taking that anniversary and making it a day of service.
There's a question here in the middle.
My name's Judy Rainey. I really don't have any affiliation other than I know somebody that works here, and I got an invitation, and this was just very interesting to me. I'm a very liberal Democrat, so the whole notion of not being able to talk about gun control and gun safety and that type of thing enrages me. But listening to everybody talk, what makes my initial question was, has it evolved to the point where there are better people that are trained? I hate the fact that they have to be this way, but are there people trained in gun violence trauma specific things where communities or individuals or whatever can go and get appropriate therapy and appropriate help? And then the fact that you went to Sandy Hook and spoke to people, to me, it almost feels like there needs to be like a SWAT team going in after any of these events.
We've talked about that.
And knowing what you know, and knowing that not everybody reacts the same way and needs the same kind of help, but just going in and offering and talking and knowing some things are going to help, especially if you find people you can speak with that have gone through the same thing, whether it's families, teachers, spouse, others that, are adjacently traumatized or whatever. Everybody needs help in their own way. And if people just know that they can ask for it or are told, these are some options that you can do within your community or whatever else. And then the last thing I'll say is the fact that I know that the White House now has a gun violence prevention or whatever. I would love for the federal and state governments to get involved with funding initiatives after events like this, where it is just an automatic thing and they go in and, and to be able to give the correct amount of help and advice and therapy and everything else, knowing what you all know now. So
I'll just say real quick. Like, when I was in Parkland, I was there, and of course there was a lot of media there, but I was interviewing all these people, and I was like at a friend's house who lived there and was doing it in her living room, and I just kept sitting there going like, why am I the only person doing this? Like, why am I the guy? I mean, I just wanted to do it, and I just came, but why am I the only person that came down here to do this, And I kept thinking to myself, there's this idea, and it's funny because I told it to Kiki, and then he said, I've had the same idea, so we've been thinking the same way. There's first responders, and in these situations, first responders, I'm not saying anything against first responders by saying this, they don't really do anything because it's done by the time they get there, basically, you know? So we almost need a first responders team of people like Kiki. I mean, it's sad to say this, but to be able to go to these events. And you actually just said something that I think is really a great idea. There needs to be a national emergency call, because national emergencies actually get funding. That's why they call them national, you know, that is a real thing to get funding. I mean, there should be that call around these events, because there should be more funding that comes from the federal government around these. That is actually a pretty amazing idea. We should bring that up to people.
Yeah, it is. Thank you for that idea. And like, we're in Colorado, we have, for some reason, an extraordinary amount of mass shootings. And so I've met with some spouses too, and had some interesting conversations with a husband in particular that said, but I bought her ski boots. I thought we'd be ready to, and I was like, oh, dude, it's this, you're like, but yes, we know that his therapist, Marguerite, ended up going to Oklahoma City to train trauma therapists there. So although I don't have deep information on that, I know that trauma therapists are training trauma therapists and that we are learning better. But the thing about Kiki speaking to these communities, or even me speaking to spouses or partners, is we are not trained therapists, but we have that lived experience, and that is seems to be very comforting. And we are not taking care of our teachers after these events. I'm just going to tell you that. And when you think about, like, the teachers at Sandy Hook, the shooting happened the last day before Christmas break. They went back 2 weeks later, but they went to a completely new building. And as an elementary teacher, I'll tell you, we put a lot of effort into our classrooms. And I know those teachers tried really hard to make their classrooms look exactly the same. So that means they were going to the, like, teacher supply stores and buying, you know, number lines and letter lines and bulletin board paper. And they spent their Christmas break preparing classrooms so that they could go back, so that kids could feel safe. But nobody paid attention to the teacher. You know, it was all, we got to take care of the kids, and we have to take care of these first responders, because clearly what they dealt with was awful. But we believe very strongly, if you take care of the teachers, they'll take care of the kids. And that it's a huge issue. I have not heard of a single school that's been through a shooting where they said, yeah, and our district did a great job taking care of us.
Now, I'll present a perspective for the parents and family members, the direct victims like that. In the case of Columbine, the family members, parents of the victims did get together regularly. And of course, part of the feeling was no one knows what you're going through like these people. Your neighbors don't know what you're experiencing. These people know what you're going through. And there was something in our case that brought us together, and that was the desire and the complete agreement. We cannot allow the school to just cover up the damage in the library. We want the library ripped out and a new library built, and eventually we raised the money to do that. So that at least became a focus for us, and that kind of brought us together. On the other hand, while we were in a way kind of supporting each other, on the other hand, sometimes it got pretty kind of angry, and it wasn't anything guided. So in the case of my wife, she went to a couple of those meetings of the parents, and she said, I can't stand this. This is a terrible trigger for me. This is not a good experience for me. I think it would have really helped to have that be more of a guided process, where we talked about our grief. Although, frankly, we would talk more about redoing the library than we talked about grief. But certainly, the anger came out, and the trauma was coming out, but it wasn't really being guided.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great point, so I will say Rob Wilcox was here from the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, but had to leave. And since its inception back in September, I know that they have done some responses to mass shootings, particularly, I believe the first one was in Lewiston, Maine, where they set up, several federal agencies responded, but also they set up long-term support or longer-term support than normal in those places, addressing some of the very things that you're talking about. However, there is still a significant need for people who are trained to respond in those situations. And so there are other, organizations or programs like the Phillips that respond at times. I can't remember the name of their organization right now, but there is a need for more people that are trained. And I can tell you, I'm also a licensed therapist, and so most therapists do not get intensive training in grief. That's not something that you get a class or maybe two if you're lucky, but on death and dying. But at the end of the day, there's not intensive like grief work. You're not trained to do that. And so I've had to go out and seek additional training to get that. And so those things are important, but I think those are also advocacy points for us, right? So that we're making sure that those things are available, but also that they're affordable for the people who are going to be doing the training and providing those services. So there are a lot of layers to that. And also with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, there was a significant amount of funding that went to mental health supports for schools and hiring teachers and also counselors, school counselors. But there's a lot more that still needs to be done. So thank you for lifting that up. So we are out of time. We're at the end of the road, but not quite there yet. So before your feet get happy, Stephen Abrams, from Brady's Team Enough is going to share a few closing remarks with us before we go.
I want to thank everyone for joining us again tonight. My name is Stephen Abrams, and I'm the National Chapter Coordinator of Team Enough. And I want to thank everyone on this panel for sharing your stories and, spending this evening with us. My generation has grown up in the shadow of the devastation of what happened at Columbine High School, and we're sometimes called the Generation Lockdown because we spent our childhoods learning how to run, hide, and fight in case our classroom was next. School shootings and threats have become intertwined with the experience of going to school in America, and communities across this country continue to grieve and work through a far too common experience. And what I do with my role at Team Enough is I work with students across the country to help provide the resources they need to organize and take action in their local community. And what I hear from students across the country is that the reason they decided to join our program was to have an opportunity to not feel helpless and to feel like they were a part of the solution. And I was actually talking to one of our Colorado leads a couple weeks ago, and she told me that doing the work makes her feel empowered and that change is possible even in a community that has been plagued by several tragedies at the hands of assault weapons. And in these past few months, I've been working a lot with our Team Enough students in Colorado to help prep them for their lobby days and their testimonies for our priority bills. I was blown away by their ability to not only talk about the bills, but how they describe what it was like to grow up, thinking about the effects that the Aurora shooting had on their community, or thinking about gun violence every single time they shopped at their local King Soopers. And they described their favorite places in their schools and how all of them, reminded them of something horrific that happened because someone got their hands on a weapon of war. In the bill they testified for, a few weeks ago in the House committee was something that they were able to share their stories and share these, share these experiences of what it's like to grow up, in the aftermath of what happened at Columbine. I think it also represented, though, that later that day, that bill that they testified for was passed out of committee, and another bill that they lobbied for passed out of both chambers in the Colorado State Legislature and is currently sitting on the governor's desk. And I think what it shows is that In this movement, it is easy to feel hopeless at times, but through community and continuing to use our voices, we will make change, we will save lives, and we will continue to fight so more parents and families don't have to feel the same pain that many people here have had to endure. And so I want to thank again to the courageous gun violence survivors and advocates like Tom, Kiki, and Kallie, and the support of all of you. And soon, we will no longer be known as Generation Lockdown, but as the generation that will end gun violence. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Again, thank you for joining us. I just want to give a quick thank you to you all for being here. The biggest thanks to you all. We can give them a round of applause. Thank you to our events team and to Chandler and Allison, the other folks on our GVP team who you probably met on your way in. Thank you for coming and safe travels.